Good afternoon, my friends. My name is Ming, and I'm the Jolly Good Fellow of Google. I'm just delighted today to have my friend here, Dr. Sylvia Lafair. Sylvia is the president of Creative Energy Options, a global consulting company focused on optimizing workplace relationships. Sylvia is also the author of this book, Don't Bring It to Work, Breaking the Family Patterns That Limit Success, which takes a fascinating look at how our relationships at home make us who we are at work, and how to identify and work with these family patterns. She will be exploring this topic with us in the next hour. And personally, I hope her next book will be Don't Bring This Accent to Work. But that'll be next year. Sylvia's articles have been published in the New York Times, the Business Week, the Wall Street Journal Online, and Time.com. And in person, I just find Sylvia to be a delightful bundle of positive, loving energy. And that's who she is. And it's just a delight to be in her presence. And my friends, let's welcome Dr. Sylvia Lafair.
I'll use this, and thank you, and the compliment is sent back. He's an amazing guy, and I'm sure most of you know that. So it's just a delight to be here with all of you. And what we're going to do is start with something. Now, I'm going to give you an idea of what I would like, and then you can decide what you want to do, okay? So take a minute. In a minute, I'm going to ask you to come up to get something. You don't know what it is, but I'm going to offer you something. So think about it. Is it worth it to come up front, or do you like to stay in your seat? So, okay, on the count of three, and the first person up here is going to get a surprise. Who? I'm not telling what it is. No, not you. And not you. Okay, first one up here. Perfect. All right, so what's your name?
Noel.
Noel. All right. So before I give you a surprise, and I hope you'll like it, tell me, what was it that made you be able to get up in front of the group and just come up here?
The last time someone asked for volunteers, I didn't get up and lost out on something nice.
Uh-huh. Okay, so we're learning about patterns. I don't know how far this is going to go. Not far enough. So, what you're going to get is a copy of my book, and I'll sign it after. Okay? I hope you like it. Okay, so I just want you to think about getting up, walking in front of the room, not knowing why, and we're going to be talking about patterns. Patterns are things that repeat and repeat. And the interesting things about patterns is the only constant in these happens to be us. Okay? So some people are, and I loved what you just said, Noel. He missed out last time, so he decided to do it differently this time. Some people will sit toward the back of the room, and some sit toward the front of the room. And if you notice, there is a pattern almost everywhere that, other than Meng right now, the front row is almost always empty, which I think is kind of interesting. I think we learned that when we went to school. You know, better to sort of hold back a little because you didn't want to get too much attention. Come on in, gentlemen. And what we're going to do now is look at how these patterns that are so deeply embedded in our nervous systems play out at work. So first, I'd like to just say a little bit about how I got into doing what I'm doing now. And the second time you're going to hear this story, but sorry. My husband, who's here with me, Herb, and I started a personal development center years ago. And you can tell by his gray hair that it's years ago. Anyway, what happened was that one day, a gentleman who had been in one of our programs, and we did a lot of work with families, said, "Will you come work with senior management?" And I said, "Why?" And he said, "They're fighting." And I said, "So what?" And he said, "But get it, Sylvia, you work with families, they have to get along. We have to get along." Make sense? So we did a lot of thinking about it and said, okay, there's shared interest through genetics, the family. Better if families get along than not. There's shared interest through genetics, through economics, the workplace. And so better if people at work get along. We can be more innovative, more creative. There's less tension. There's more fun. So we decided to go in and work with his senior team. And miracle of miracles, or I wouldn't be standing here today, things did get better. So we began to research the place that is, I think, the most exciting place. And you folks are in, obviously, one of the most innovative places up here at Google, where you have to begin to think out of the box, think new thoughts, think innovation, think that there are different ways to do things. And we began to go touch and go to find out what the criteria is and what to bring to work and what not to bring to work. So here we go. You see this picture? Everybody has a variation on that picture somewhere. Somewhere for each of us, there's a picture of a family. And what's interesting is when you look at the office and you're not at a dinner table, you're at an office meeting table, the same behaviors apply. The original organization we all joined was the family. And whether you liked it or not, you signed on. And what happens is what we learned in that family is what we bring into the workplace. It's where we learned about fairness. It's where we learned about being the star or the one who, everybody picks on. It's where we learned about honesty and integrity. And it's a very interesting thing when we take what we learn there and bring it into the workplace. So what we're going to do is look at some of the patterns. Now, what we've done is we have pulled together 13 patterns that we see that are very available in families and are also very prevalent in the workplace. There are more. You can have more than one. We're usually a combination of 3 and 4. There's usually 1 or 2 that seem to signify us, and when people talk about things, you'll know that usually we can see them on others before we see it on themselves. We're going to look at how to diminish conflict. You can't ever get away from conflict. Conflict is just the name of life, but we can diminish it. And what we can do once we learn some of these rules is we can shorten the time that we have to be upset with each other, and we can do better with the depth of the upset that we have to have with each other. So that's what we're going to do. And then we're going to look at systems, relationships. We are individuals, and we're also part of a system. And we're always part of a system somewhere or another. So we have to look at both aspects of that. Okay, so patterns. Rather than ask, I'm going to give you the answer right now. There are things that repeat over and over. And I'd like to give you a few really quick takeaways for this. One of the big takeaways is as you listen to yourself and listen to others, and you hear the words always or never, know that you've entered the land of patterns. We had a gal who years ago worked with us, and when she was interviewed, she was going to report directly to me. She said, I never get along with male bosses. And I thought, okay, I hear that. She was going to be reporting to me. Later, she reported to one of the other men in our company, and guess what? She was right. She finally self-selected out, but she never got along with male bosses. So you begin to say, where do we get all these always and never from? They start from when we're very little, and we have what we call self-fulfilling prophecies that we begin to work with. So patterns, where do they begin? They begin in the family, they begin in our culture, and they come out of crises. And what happens is when we begin to search in a personal growth kind of way, in coaching, and this kind of stuff in the workplace is very valid. These are valid questions to ask. How did I get to be who I am? What is it that is keeping me from ultimate success, or what is it that I'm doing that really is helping others? And those are the kinds of questions you want to ask yourselves. You want to look at your teammates and maybe have dialogues with them around it. So we're going to look at family for a minute. As I said, it's the original organization into which you were born. A lot of the things you do came from there, not good or bad, passed down through the generations. And it's also part of your genetic memory. And I want to give you an example of genetic memory. Who here grew up in the middle of the country in the U.S., away from water? Anybody? Where? Ohio. How far were you from the ocean? A long way. So you couldn't get up in the morning, say, we're going to go to the beach just for the afternoon and come back. Somebody else? Where I saw?
Colorado and Arizona.
Okay, so now think about this. If you're a kid and your family is saying, we're going to go take a trip and we're going to see the ocean. Different here. You can get there pretty quickly. The ocean's a big deal. You know, it's a big piece of water, big, exciting place. So it's really talked up, and you get to wherever you're going to go, California beach, Florida beach, and everybody's excited, and they're telling you you're 2, 3 years old. Oh, the ocean's big, it's beautiful, there are waves, there's sand. You get there, and it's a rainy day, and you can't go on the beach. It's a bummer. And your parents are saying, or whoever you go with, caretakers, oh, this is terrible, it's not fair. And you have to go back to the motel room, and you're sitting there kind of watching the same cartoons you've seen, and you're very frustrated. That's a memory that goes into your nervous system. It's called a mem. And what happens is, fast forward 20 years later, and you're going to the beach. You maybe have moved from Colorado or Ohio, and you're going to the beach, and it's a really pretty day. The problem is, inside you're feeling sad or depressed. Well, instead of Prozac, go back and think about, where did this begin? Sometimes you're going to find the answer, sometimes you're not. So just asking the question is the good place to start. But what happens is, these are the kinds of things that go into our genetic memory. And once we can scoot back, and there are lots of ways to do it, and there are lots of quizzes you can do that you can find answers to. So you begin to look at that. So now we're going to look at culture patterns. And culture patterns are on many levels. One is the area of the country or the world in which you grew up. There are cultural norms that are there. It's also the time in which you grew up. And they will, in many ways, determine how you see, think, be about what you're watching. I was just at a meeting in Philadelphia from the Governor's Conference for Women, and one of the gals was interesting. She was saying, remember when we used to talk about the glass ceiling and the old boys club? She said, if you notice, we're breaking that model now, and people aren't talking about it the way they used to. That's a culture change. But these patterns are embedded in us. The other is about inclusion and exclusion. So there's some really deep thinking you can do about where and how these patterns started, and what we call these patterns, the cultural patterns, are what they become not, as in am not, cannot, should not, will not, or not like me. And they get played out in the workplace, and we're going to talk about that in more detail in a minute. Crises patterns we call split-second hardening of the emotions. So who here remembers where they were on September 11th, 2001? As I'm saying that, can you get a memory of what it felt like? Yeah. I'll bet everybody in here, there's a sense of inhaling, of hard to breathe. And our retreat center is just a couple of hours from New York. And I remember that afternoon saying, I have to go help. It couldn't get out, couldn't get into New York even if I wanted to. But there was a sense in me of saying, I can't just sit here watching what's going on. I have to help. But I couldn't help. Excuse me? Yeah, and we had just started one of our leadership programs, and the group couldn't get in. We had a refrigerator filled with food, and nobody could get in. We couldn't get out. But what happened that was so powerful is it locked in for me a memory that was how I started to put this together with the workplace. My father died very suddenly of a heart attack when I was 14. And on a Saturday night, my parents had gone out to the movies, and Sunday we were planning a funeral. And it was pretty shocking. Now, I did a lot of personal work around this, but fast forward 20 years, and we had an assistant who was wonderful. We loved her. Her name was Lisa. And one day she walked into the office with a big grin on her face, and she said, "Could I see you?" And she came into the office. I didn't like the grin. It was too big. It was too happy. I knew there was something there, and I wasn't sure. And, we said, "What is it?" She said, "Well, do you remember I said when my check from the IRS comes back, if I got a certain amount of money, I was going to go back to school?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, I got even more than that, and I'm going to go back to school, so I just want to tell you I can stay for another month." And I have to tell you, this is when I began to see how this plays out at work in a very mature way as a leader of a company. I burst into tears and said, "You can't do that." And it was fascinating. And my husband was with me since we worked together, and he said, "Sylvia, how can you stop somebody from going back to school?" But I was in another place. So we asked Lisa to leave, and he said to me, I know Lisa's great, but, there's something else going on here. And we sat for a while, and I was able to track back that when my father died, nobody asked me. It was sudden. It was hardening of the emotions. And here was Lisa saying to me, "I'm leaving. I'm not asking your permission. I want you to be happy." It was certainly a much more joyful way to be than it would have been the other way. But what happened was I began to understand that we do bring our families to work with us. We bring everything that happened to us before we came into the workplace in this space. And as I saw that connection, we started to connect more and more dots that came with us. Now, the good news here was we called Lisa back. I apologized. I told her, that I was really upset about something that had nothing to do with her. And for me, one of the things that was very positive and healing was that I was able to say, "I would like to be the head of the committee for your farewell party." So it was different than what happened when I was a kid. So we planned a really fun party, and Lisa went off, and she has remained a friend of ours all these years. Those are the dots you begin to connect. So it's family, culture, crises. We all have aspects of all of that for each of us, and we have to look at what's going on there. So Albert Einstein had a great definition of insanity. I'm sure many of you know this one. Doing the same things over and over and expecting different results. Is that familiar? Do we all do it? Am I seeing head shaking in here? Yeah. So what we're teaching is the way out. And out stands for observing, understanding, and then transforming. And you need to put some elbow grease in this. This is not an easy thing to do, but it is doable. Okay, the way out. As I said, it's those moments that you have where you go, "Aha, I never thought of it that way before. Now I see another way." Okay? I'm going to look more deeply. And we have lots of questions on our website. You can take a pattern quiz to find out what your basic patterns are. And you can even call the office, and they'll go over the results with you. So you can get a sense of where this is locked in you and what to do about it. So I'd like to look at each of us. We all were given a deck of cards. And think about it. The deck of cards that Billy Joel's kids were given are different than the deck of cards that Billy the kids, and I hear he had a lot of kids, his kids were given. And we all really have to look at what is our deck of cards. It's not good or bad. It's just the deck of cards that we were given. And in that deck of cards, there are all kinds of patterns that show up. So some of the patterns, and I just would like to go over this quickly with you, is the clown. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand if you see yourself as a clown, but anybody know a clown? Somebody at work? Okay. I see one hand going up over there. How do you know that that person is a clown? What do they do or show? Yeah, yeah, yeah. You'll see a lot of these patterns playing out in meetings, okay? Because we've all taken on roles in our families, and we usually have those roles that come out in the workplace. So the clown is somebody, you're in a meeting, it's kind of tense, and somebody will make a joke. And what happens is it deflects things. You stop thinking about what was going on for the minute, and you go back to either laughing at the joke or rolling your eyes thinking, gosh, that was really a dumb joke. Now what happens is often those who are in the clown category grew up in families where they were there to help make jokes to lighten up the load in the family. It's interesting, Jim Carrey was being interviewed on Larry King Live one night, and Larry King said to him, "Were you always funny?" Then he said, "You know, Larry, I learned how to be funny as a kid because I had a mother who was ill all the time. So I would come home from school and I would put shows on for her and I would do dances. I would do anything to make her laugh." And he said it just carried on into my life. Now, what happens a lot with clowns is if they can begin to understand what they're doing, they can turn into humorists. The difference between a clown and a humorist is timing. Humorists will put the joke in at the moment when it has an effect that's really positive. Clowns will do something so they can deflect the tension from people. And you know, you have an office mate who's a clown who may remind you of your dad who was a clown or a brother who was a clown. So somewhere there's a connection that goes one way or the other. The avoider. Anybody here know an avoider? They're the gotta-go guy or gal. They're the ones in meetings when it gets tense who will look at their watch and say, whoops, I have a meeting, I have to call India. And you say, well, it's 2 o'clock in the morning there. And they say, oh, well, they'll be up anyway. They'll do anything to get out of the meeting because they want to get away from the tension. And sometimes we have sisters who were the kind who avoided everything, or a mother or a father or a brother. It doesn't matter, but somewhere, and often there was in those families a lot of tension that developed when they were kids, and they learned conflicts don't get handled, so you got to go. And it can be a difficult time for that. Victims, we all know those who are saying, it's always my fault, why me, I did it. You know, I'm going to get in trouble. I'm the one. And sometimes it reminds you of, you know, your office mate, and then you can look back and maybe it's an aunt in your family who was always playing the victim. But these are the kinds of things in every deck of cards. Here's the good news, bad news. We are some of these patterns, A. B, all the people around us are other patterns. So what we want to learn is how to understand these patterns and how to transform them. Now, what I'd like to do is talk about today and the economy we're living in. And here's basically what happens. When stress, this is really the key right here. When stress hits the hot button, we're all prone to go back to these patterns that we learned as kids. And so if you walk around and say about one of your office mates, he or she is acting like a baby, you're right. It's not good or bad, it's a natural tendency. Anxiety and stress kick in and will make us go to these places. Does that make sense? Might see some heads shaking. Yeah, makes sense? Okay, so we have to learn how to get out of it. Now here's what I see happening today in this economy. We call it the FDIC. It's kind of an insurance policy. If you begin to look at this, it can help you learn about yourself and about others that you're talking about. First of all, there's a concept called flooding. And flooding means saying the same thing over and over, getting louder and louder, thinking the louder you are, the more they'll hear you. Doesn't work, but that's what we do when we flood until the volume is so strong and the emotion is so strong, everybody wants to get away from you. And I have to admit, that's my pattern of That's my pattern, I must admit it. And what happens is those who have that kind of pattern are usually the super achievers, the ones who have to be tops, best, and if they can't be, the anxiety gets to be too much and they get upset. The persecutor is the one who's poking a finger and saying you, and they get louder and louder as they're doing it. And the drama queen or king. And what I'd like you to know is, gentlemen, there are as many drama kings as there are drama queens. But I happen to be in that venue. And so when I get upset, I've learned how to stop it quicker. Remember, you're not going to ever not have conflict, but you're also going to be able to take a deep breath and say, it doesn't have to go as long and it doesn't have to be as deep. So there you go. Drama queen, drama king, stamp your feet, get louder and louder. Super achiever, same thing, get louder and louder to get your point across. Persecutor, get louder and louder. The next one's deflecting, and deflecting is very different. Deflecting is like the clown we talked about. And you'll be in a meeting and it's tense and somebody will say, see that bird that just flew by the window? And everybody's head turns toward the bird, right? But it doesn't help make things change. It just means that we're all looking at the bird. So deflectors block conversations. They prevent conflict from coming to completion. And when we're in there, they'll keep saying, oh, there's the bird. The bird's on the tree. Oh, the bird moved over to... And you're going, who cares? But that's what you're watching. And the patterns that do that often are the rebel. And there are also positives about some of these, but often the rebel is the one who's saying, it's not working, it's not working. And they often go into HR very quickly, or they say, I have a lawyer. And my lawyer said, and everybody gets kind of nervous. The clown, as we talked about, the procrastinator who's always saying tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. That's deflecting. Now, we all have a primary way of doing this. It's not good or not bad. We need to know what it is. And again, if you can take the quiz and find out, you're in a better place for that. Indulging is a little bit different. It's sort of like that addictive quality of wallowing in the details. And as a perfect example was a gal who we were in a meeting, and she brought in a brochure, and she said, she had 3 different brochures. She said, which color green do you like better? Everybody said it's the same green. No, this green's different than this has more yellow, that has more blue. Which green do you like better? And it was, again, who cares? Just get the work done. But in indulging, you keep saying the same things over and over again, and you want to keep going deeper and engaging people in the conversation, and you end up holding people captive. So indulgers are the ones who are pleasers, and they say yes to everything, and the martyrs who come in early, leave late, and they usually want something from you. It's either your firstborn child or your new car, but they're there wanting things from you. The rescuer who will jump in and save, and the victim is an indulger. Poor me, poor me, poor me. The fourth and the final part of these 4 that we all do when we're really under stress is compartmentalize. And that is we only see one aspect of what's going on. And there was a group we were working with, and they had a project that had to be done, and they said, we'll be here till midnight, and that's okay. And about 4 o'clock, one of the guys said, all right, I'm going. And they said, where? And he said, to the gym. I'm out of here. And they said, but wait a minute, you've got to get this done. And no, I'm going. And he couldn't see that he really needed to be there to finish. So what happens is they get tidbits of information, and then they have to leave. It's too much. They can't see the whole thing. So the avoider, gotta go guy, the denier, what problem? And the splitter who says, well, this guy tells me one thing and I'll believe that, and this other guy tells me something else and I'll believe that, and you never get anything fully completed. So what happens is in all these patterns, they begin to talk to each other. So I'm going to give you a few quick clues. If you're with a super achiever and you know them, you know who they are, me, I'm the first one. The best way to talk with them is to say something like, I know you're really good at what you do. They won't hear you unless they're acknowledged. I know you're really good at what you do. So that's where you start. The next thing is, so-and-so, Nancy needs some help with this. And I'll bet that you can help her with it. Now, superachievers don't like to help anybody else. They like to do it themselves, and they like to get the awards, and they like to be recognized. But if you begin to cross this bridge into the helping area, that's what one of the things we were talking about at lunch was moving toward altruism, bless you, altruism and helpfulness, and compassion. We can move in that direction. We can help each other with this. So first, make sure you tell them that, yes, by goodness, they're really good. And then say, with all your good skills, here's how you can help. And that really is a shapeshifter. With an avoider who becomes an initiator is to say, if you can stay here with me and help us through this, and these words often work, it would mean a lot. Just those words, it would mean a lot, usually get an avoider to stand still. And that's what we have to do. So we begin to look at all these patterns and how they talk to each other, and then begin to look at the way to observe, to understand, and to transform. So here's what I'd like you to do right now, is just on your right hand, I'm going to go through some of the patterns, and if that's you, just put a little pressure on that hand, okay? And on your left hand, if it's somebody you know, okay? I'm just curious to see what you come up with. So superachiever. Superachiever, are you one? You're not going to have to stand up and say, hello, my name is, and I'm a superachiever. I promise you that. But you're just going to get an idea of where you fit in this. So superachiever, me. I'm the first. I'm the best. Okay? Do you know one, or are you one? Next is the pleaser. And the pleaser only knows the word yes. No is a very hard word for them to say. They don't mean yes all the time, but that's how they say it, because no would be to hurt or disappoint somebody, and that's too big a risk. So hand, are you a pleaser, or do you know a pleaser? Okay. Another one that I mentioned was a denier. That's somebody who never sees a problem. We had a big thing here, and I don't want to go into politics, but a year ago, right around now, there were a lot of people saying, what problem with the economy? There's no problem with the economy. We had a lot of people doing that when there was a problem. Deniers are going, everything's fine. They can see people grimacing, but they'll still say there's no problem here. Do you know a denier, or are you a denier? Okay, 2 more. Another one would be the martyr, the one who says, I'm always doing everything for everybody. Do you do that, or do you know somebody who does that? Okay. One more would be the procrastinator. That's the person who says, it'll be done tomorrow, I promise it'll be done. And then tomorrow comes and they say, well, I need another day. Procrastinator. Do you know one? Or are you one? So on the hand, the left hand, which was you, how many people had more than 3? Let me see a hands up in the air. That you saw yourself in any of these. Oh, yourself was your right hand. I'm sorry. How many saw themselves in any of these patterns? Okay. How many saw a lot of other people with the left hand? And some of you didn't see the patterns at all, is what I'm getting. Okay. How many of you didn't see the patterns on yourself or anybody else? We're just not getting hands up with that. Okay. All right. One of the things that is really good to do is to begin to notice when you're in the different situations how you're saying always and never, how you're saying this is the way that person is and how annoyed that gets you, and how you say and own, this is me, I have that tendency. So those are the things I'd like you to take with you and look at. And here's the good news. The patterns can be transformed, okay? So the superachiever, once they get it, becomes a creative collaborator. And one of the pharmaceutical groups we worked with, there was a brilliant scientist, and she had a team, and everybody on her team was stupid. Everybody was, stupid. And I said to her one day, when is it going to be my turn to be stupid? And she said, no, that won't happen. I said, till I say something you don't like, and then I'll go in the stupid category. She finally was able to understand that her need to be first was bigger than it was to work with the team. And once she began to understand that, change came, and she had a team that could work together. But she had to begin to say to them, look, I don't want to be this way anymore, and I need some help with it. She did it through some coaching, and she did it by having some honest conversations with her team. The rebel, rather than having to say, I have a lawyer, becomes a community builder and says, wait a minute, there has to be a better way to do this, and let's all work together to get it done. The procrastinator becomes a realizer, and that means somebody who gets the work done, who makes the work happen. The clown, as I said, becomes a humorist, and that's Mark Twain kind of had the market on that. It's being able to say something in the right time that'll get a laugh, but not something that deflects everything. The persecutor, who's always pointing their finger, you, can point it up and become a visionary and say, we can work together and find a better way. The persecutor's always looking at a victim, and the victim, instead of saying me, wah, 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 is saying, I'm going to find a new way, and they become explorers. The rescuer, who's always jumping in to save the victim, becomes a mentor, and the mentor asks questions rather than simply says, I'll take care of it for you and I'll help you with it. The drama queen or king becomes a good storyteller, and that's where I learned how to take some of my drama. What happened and how I understood this is in one day in the morning, I was stamping my foot, and somebody said to me, man, that's enough drama for a week. And I thought, well, that's just what they have to say. And later that day, I was with my team, and they said, a little too much drama. And then later that day, one of my daughters and I were talking, and she said, Mom, too much drama. I think I'll talk to you another day. And I went, whoa, the only constant in there is me. And that's how these patterns started to develop and how we began to work with them. The martyr becomes an integrator, and instead of saying, I'll carry that very heavy rock up that very steep hill alone, the martyr begins to say, okay, you do that, you do that, you do that, and we'll all get it up there together. The pleaser learns how to become a truth teller. The pleaser, we were in a meeting, and it was very interesting. The owner of this company wanted to buy another business. He had a thing about buying businesses, and he would always turn to his general manager and say, take care of it. And we were together with them in a senior meeting, and he said, I just thought of another business to buy, and it got really quiet, and he said, what do you think? And it got even quieter, and finally she turned to him and she said, my tendency is to be a pleaser, and I can't do it anymore. And if you want to buy the business, that's up to you, but the problem here is I won't be able to participate. It's too much. It's going to be too much on me and too much on the team. Well, needless to say, it was very, very quiet in that room. Very quiet for a long time. It was probably 60 seconds, but it felt like about 2 years. And then the owner of the company said, you've never said that before. And she said, I'm just now learning how to say the word no where it's appropriate. What happened is she became a bit of a hero for the group. And it wasn't a mutiny against the boss. She and the boss had a discussion, and she said, everybody's afraid to say to you this isn't working, and I'm not willing to do it anymore. My health is at stake. The team's health is at stake. We're not going to do it. And she had to practice. The word N-O, no, is a hard one for pleasers to say. But she became a truth teller, and you could see it in her life, and 6 months later, the company was at a whole new place. He did not buy that business, by the way, and it was probably one of the best decisions that he made. And, you know, he was able to acknowledge her in a team meeting later. It was a pretty powerful kind of thing. The avoider becomes the initiator who says, no, instead of me running from the conflict, I'm going to sit here and make sure we talk about it. The denier becomes a trust builder by saying there is a problem and we have to face it and we're going to dig down and find solutions. And the splitter who goes from one to the other becomes a peacemaker saying, listen, we have to stop all the office politics and the gossip and talk together and work together and be together. And so in between where it says the pattern and the transformation, there's a lot of elbow grease. That's where the work is. That's what I call strength training. I believe it's really important for everybody in business to understand these and to make a commitment not to change the other person out there, because it's not possible, but to change ourselves, because in changing ourselves, what we do is we begin the process of making a shift for the whole team and for ourselves. And yeah, my husband, Herb, just wanted me to remind you that one of the things we teach is that work is not a rehab facility. So if there are places where there isn't a capacity to break through, that's okay too. Sometimes people have to self-select out or be offered the way out to find out in another situation what they're going to do. These are what we call pattern-aware leaders. These are people who have looked inside and have made changes for themselves, and in doing that, others have changed. So Martin Luther King has been an incredible community builder. Nelson Mandela, an integrator. Abraham Lincoln, and if you haven't read Team of Rivals, even though it's a very thick book, it's an incredible book of the brilliance of becoming a community builder. Eleanor Roosevelt was an integrator. She, at a time that women in the culture of the times didn't have a lot to say, said, wait a minute, I will stand up and say what needs to be said and not just have tea parties. And the Dalai Lama is obviously an incredible peacemaker. So that's kind of the grand scheme overview, and I'd love to open this up to questions, comments. I know I've thrown a lot at you in a short time, but I really wanted to get across the idea that these are in us, and if we can transform them, we can move to next levels of really positiveness in our work and who we are. So thank you so much. And any questions anybody has? Thank you.
So I'm wondering if there are any patterns and themes in how people can recognize their own patterns that are when they're operating. I know sometimes it's just so default for us, but maybe there are some tips or recommendations you have there.
Beautiful. Yeah. What you can do, and we in our leadership program, we ask people to do this, is to, at the end of each day, jot down places where you were really annoyed, where somebody really bothered you. Now, it'll always start with out there, which is okay. But if you do that and keep this for a couple of weeks, you'll begin to see the dots connecting. You know, it's interesting. Did you ever sit in a meeting and two people could say, tomorrow's Tuesday, and the first person who says it, you go, okay, tomorrow's Tuesday. The next person who says it, you go, can't they ever just keep their mouth shut? You know, so you begin to say, what is it about that person or that moment that bothered me, and it didn't in the other way? But if you begin to jot this thing down, jot these down, your task is to connect the dots. They're connectable. We've done this now for 20 years, and thus the book has come out. And you can really begin to see how the same situation or the same person on different days really starts to get you. The other thing is really trust your gut. We have an internal mechanism in our solar plexus right around here that, you can call it the BS detector. We think it's in here, but it's really down here. And if you're in a situation that really starts to bother you, and you feel that tightening in you, just jot it down. You don't have to write long dissertations, a couple of sentences, and do it for a month, and I promise you, you'll begin to see your own patterns showing up. What we've also found is in teams, when people begin to understand this, they can help each other. You know, and it's not finger pointing saying, oh, you are we're not meant to emblazon these patterns on our foreheads. We're not the patterns. It is just a part of who we are. So did that help? Go ahead.
As you were talking, it also made me think of, I don't know if you've read any of Debbie Ford's work about sort of shadow processes of the personality. And one thing she recommends is looking for where that lives in you. So really identifying, how do I show up as an avoider, or how do I show up as a denier, as a way in.
Yeah. Well, that's good, and Debbie Ford's work is really good. One of the things you can polish the shadow side if you want, these patterns, and the transformed, or what we call the healthy opposites. And once you begin to look at that, it's what I have found is people usually do better if they're looking out there first, because it's just our human nature, and then bring it inside and say, wait a minute, if so-and-so is really bothering me day after day after day, what part am I playing in this? And then start to turn it. So that was a really good question. Anybody else? Questions?
So kind of on what you were saying before, of so-and-so is so really bothering you, and maybe it's their super achiever and you're the rebel or something. Are there personality types that are in direct conflict, and without putting the whole team through leadership training, how do you resolve that?
Excellent. Yeah. It's called I'm going to repeat it, but it's called the battle of the patterns. And sometimes the patterns we have are very intense, and they do. One other person will just drive us absolutely up the wall. Here's the part. You can take it offline. The question is, do you have to do it in front of the whole team, or can you take it offline and work with it? Is that one of the questions you're asking?
Well, if it's just a constant thing,
Yeah.
are there patterns that are in direct conflict with each other?
Oh, sure. Well, then let me put it this way. There's always resolution. It may not be in the time frame you like, but it could take longer. I'll give you an example. As a drama queen, and I'm married to an avoider, I mean, some of the stuff we've done would be Comedy Central. You know, I'm going ba-ba, 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 ba, and my husband's going, gotta go. And we work together, so there you go. And he'd be going out the door, and I'm following him and saying, you can't leave. And he's going, that drama is too much. And so what happened is, one of the things he learned, we won't talk about me at the moment, but was to be an initiator. And what happened is he would then say, we're in the middle of this. We're going to sit down and talk about it. And I'm there with my mouth open going, no, you're supposed to leave. we can't talk about this. Then I can't do my drama queen. What happens is one person has to make the decision to make the change. Now, the change is internal. It is ours. It's what we're talking about. It's what Dan Goleman talks about when he talks about emotional intelligence. Ultimately, the change is ours to make. It is also possible to make it together. So I believe people do need to go offline who are driving each other crazy and talk about it. The way it stops is whoever the first one is to own the pattern, literally own it. We do a process called PEP Talk, which stands for Pattern Encounter Process, where it's almost like a big sumo wrestler in the sky, and you have to tackle this thing to the ground. Two people together can make agreements on how they're going to behave differently in the next meeting, and the next meeting you see changes that are incredible. Often you'll need a facilitator to help if it gets to be too much. But once you begin, as I talked about this gal who said as a pleaser she was turning into a truth teller, it changed the whole context of the team, because other people then were able to speak up and say what they needed to. What I'm suggesting is that the ultimate thing we need to be doing now is learning how to tell the truth and have the courage to stand with it. and not be afraid. And as we do that, other people become very, it's very appealing. And so what happens at that point is the dialogue begins and it's different. So does that help? Anybody else? Questions, comments, thoughts? I know you have a question.
I have too many questions.
Find one.
I have so many questions. I'll just ask the one that comes to my mind immediately, which is you did this work as a family therapist before a corporate therapist of some sort. I'm wondering what the differences are, like between like at home and at work, that we can learn from.
That's very good. It began working with families. I will tell you, I find working in the business world faster, more effective than I ever did with families, which is it was a surprise to me too, because I was used to usually dissatisfied spouses dragging in their partner who would sit there going, how long till I get out of here? Whereas at work, there is this yearning to be the best, do the best, find a way to what's next. And I have found people listen more quickly. And it's a little safer to have a discussion with a colleague who's upset than with your husband or wife who's upset. And what happens there is it gets translated back home. And we've had a lot of people, spouses, partners, call up and say, thank you. And I'd say, for what? And they'd say, I don't know what you're doing, but so-and-so is really asking better questions, being nicer. The biggest thing in this is learning how to ask the questions that will forward the dialogue. But I have found in the workplace it moves much more quickly. And when people on teams are beginning to see really, really good successes and people are working together in a more effective manner without, sitting in meetings. And if you're not rolling your eyes in meetings, sometimes internally you're rolling your eyes in meetings. We all do that. And we have a little video we didn't bring for this because it's too short a presentation of what goes on in meetings that are not seen. And we show this, and I said, this is what a meeting really looks like. And people were throwing spitballs at each other and combing their hair and on their cell phones and complaining. And I said, is this really a meeting? Is this? And we had taken a group that we worked with for a long time, and we said, play out what you think is going on internally. And it's pretty funny when you see it, because you can be sitting in the room behaving very properly, but your mind isn't there. And I'll give you one that was very powerful. And it changed this guy's personal life as well as his business life. We were doing best practices, and he stood up. We were sitting at a big table, and there were about 20 people, and he stood up, and he started going on and on about how wonderful he was and all these great successes he had had. And I looked around the room, and nobody was there. I mean, people were out shopping in their minds. Somebody was saying, I have to call and see how the kids are doing. Somebody else was figuring out some equation that they were working on in their mind. And finally, I stopped it. I happened to be running the meeting, and I said to him, and I'm offering this to you, it's a pretty powerful sentence. All I said to him is, what is your intention? Trust me, everybody came back in the room at that moment. They stopped buying their cars outside. They stopped going to the market. In the room, all eyes were on this guy. His name was Jerry. It was very quiet. I didn't know what he was going to say. And finally, he looked around the room and he said, I apologize. He said, I was grandstanding. And my intention was to just show you how really good I am. And it went to overkill. So I did what good facilitators do. I took a break. And I watched, when we took the break, how many people made a beeline to pat him on the back or shake his hand or thank him, because he did what? He told the truth. And when we came back after the break, we didn't spend time going into what did you think of what happened. It wasn't appropriate or necessary. We went on to what's next. The rest of that afternoon, they were kick-ass in terms of coming up with new creative ideas, because there was something so enlivening about the fact that in a few seconds he told the truth, owned his pattern. You know, he didn't stand there and say, I'm a superachiever. He said, I was grandstanding. You don't have to use the names of these patterns as much. You just have to begin to be conscious of it. And he became a bit of a hero for the rest of that year. People were going to him and really asking him about how he was doing what he was doing once he was able to own it. So then he took that home, and what happened was his wife called and said, I don't hear him talking me, and how great I am anymore. You know, he's become more of a collaborator. So good question. Thank you. Anybody else? Thoughts?
So far, you've covered a lot of dysfunctional behaviors. And you start with a team that's in trouble or a family that's in trouble, and to find the patterns of this dysfunction and try to address and make things better. What if my team has no dysfunction? It's special. You know, rather than focus on the negative of all the dysfunction, trying to cure them, what are some of the patterns that we could look for to actually nurture and you know, get to the next level?
Perfect. Yeah, beautiful. The patterns, and they seem all to be in the neocortex, are the patterns of altruism, of sharing, of higher level communication. This book that was written was about finding out the patterns that aren't working, that we don't need to bring to work anymore, and to move out of the lower parts of the brain. But I think that once you get a team that really is helpful and you begin to continuously acknowledge that, there's tools we have, I can't go into now, but for even heightening the innovative, creative part of working together, the aha part of it. And once we break through some, and obviously you're very lucky and you've done good work and have a good team, that's where we're headed. We're headed to teams that work together. This one team that we worked with, the one I told you did this, how to have a meeting that was really kind of crazy, they were winning awards in their company all over the place. And we started getting a lot of calls, and I would say, what do you want? And they say, we want to be like ABC team. And I go, why? And some of them said, because they're bringing in so much money and they're so good at sales and blah, 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 blah. Couple of groups that called said, we watch them at some of the meetings. They really like each other. We see it when they go out to dinner. We see it at breaks. That's what we want. Those were the ones we chose to do more of the work with. The funny thing is, at the end of the year, there was more competition for the higher levels success in sales because these other groups were getting there too. So you just keep going and you do lots of acknowledging. So that's a very good question. Well, I see our time is up. Oh, I'm told move the slide. So you can take the quiz on our website, send it to a friend, and you can get a consultation that will help you dig more deeply into where the pattern comes from and then decide what you want to do with it. And that's it. Thanks to everyone. Thank you.